I I called my message today a day at the beach. I don't know. This felt like it was a good title for a day of a picnic, right? A day at the beach, the beginning, the beginning. It was just a day at the beach, but it was also the beginning of Christianity. When Jesus went from being simply a teacher to the leader and the founder of a movement. And as you read through Jesus' story, you'll discover how much of it happened around the water. He's always around the water, isn't he? Much of Jesus' ministry was focused on the area that we've known as the Sea of Galilee. But while Galilee, it really wasn't a sea. It was really just a lake. But it was their lake. And it didn't matter if you referred to it as the Sea of Galilee or the Lake of Galilee or one of many other names that it had. It was the focal point of the people that lived in the area. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was born around the time of Jesus' death, claimed that there were 9 good-sized communities surrounding that lake, and that there were over 230 fishing boats that worked the waters of that day. Now, from reading the Gospels, we know that Jesus has been born, he's been baptized by John the Baptist, and he was tempted in the wilderness. But his ministry didn't really begin yet. There have been no records of miracles having taken place at this point yet. The crowds aren't yet flocking to hear his words. He hasn't started upsetting the religious leaders of the day yet. After all, up until now, he has been just a solitary voice, attracting very little attention with his teaching. And this incident is pivotal in the history of what would become the Christian church, which would eventually change the world. And it all started one day at the beach. I don't think we could ever state how important what happened on the beach that day would be, not only to Peter and Andrew and Zebedee's boys, but to the whole world as a whole. I want to show you a brief clip.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not 2 nuts. 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So Over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, the TED. Thanks.
So why did I want to share that with you? Well, this was the day that a movement began. The day that a lone leader attracted his first follower. So what is it that we can learn from this day at the beach? Well, one day, Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it all started on an ordinary day, just an ordinary day. So often we want to make those insignificant days different from all the others, but this was just an ordinary day. Jesus was walking along on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes Jesus meets us in very ordinary moments, not just on Sundays, but on any day. On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. On that ordinary morning, if you could have talked to Peter that day and asked him, well, what are your plans for the day? Maybe he would have talked about, well, I'm just going to go to work today, like I do every day. Or maybe he had some special plans for what he would do at work, or maybe he was thinking, when I'm finished work, I'm going to go home and go for a walk with my wife. Yeah, that's where. See, we know that on that day, he was fishing from the shore. He wasn't out in his boat. And even though from other accounts, we know that he owned a boat, but maybe he had heard that the fish were close at hand. And he could avoid the extra work of having to get his boat all ready and launching it. And maybe he'd tell you what he'd planned to do after the fishing was done. Maybe that he would take his wife for a walk, or maybe he was going to putter around the house a little bit. But I'm pretty sure that his plans did not include meeting the Messiah, Son of God, and having his life turned upside down. The day that I became a Christ follower is one day that I'll always remember. It was a beautiful, clear, sunny day on the 20th of February, 1985. That was the day when I first experienced the grace of God. And I'll digress just for a moment, tell you that I knew that my sins were forgiven that day, and that I was made new. How did I know that? Well, it was a life-changing experience, a day that I'll never forget. And it was a day where I actually heard an audible voice speak to me. Now, that's part of a longer story that I'm going to tell you another time. But I just want to say that it started out as an ordinary day, and then it changed. And because of that ordinary day, I met the Creator of the universe. And the New Testament is full of stories of how people encountered Jesus, and they all started out as ordinary days. Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, for God says, at just the right time, I heard you. On the day of salvation, I helped you. Really? The right time is now? Today is the day of salvation. When is the day of salvation? It's today. And we could wait for special days and special things to happen, or we could realize that today can be that special day. Because ultimately, you will choose whether the day will stay ordinary or become special. Peter met Jesus on the beach. But as he chose to allow that meeting to change his life, he allowed it to go beyond just a nod and a smile. No. See, Jesus didn't just go for a walk that day. Let me go back to the story. In Mark chapter 1, one day, as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. See, it started with ordinary people. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was God, and I'm not, but if I was God and I was looking around for someone who would lead a movement and change the world, I'm not sure that I would have picked Peter. Seriously? Peter? I mean, Peter had problems with a temper. And he had a tendency to kind of shoot off his mouth. And he waffled a little bit in his faith. It's just that Peter seems so much like us, doesn't he? You see, God has a habit of using ordinary people. Moses, Gideon, David, Daniel, Peter. Just ordinary people, but people who God chose to use, and people who chose to allow God to use them. We look at Peter and we see the ordinary. God looks at Peter and sees a world changer. There's a story in the Old Testament of when Samuel the prophet was given the task of selecting the second king of Israel. Well, you know the story. God directs him to go to a little obscure town called Bethlehem and to meet a man named Jesse, who had a number of sons, one of whom would be chosen to be the future king. The Bible tells us that when Samuel met Jesus' sons, he was immediately impressed with Eliab. And then we read God's response to Samuel's suggestion in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And that's why we know that the son of a dairy farmer from North Carolina, known as Billy Graham, or the daughter of an Albanian businessman as Mother Teresa, and, or a preacher kid from Georgia known as Martin Luther King Jr. All just ordinary men and women. Don't ever sell yourself short. God has a wonderful plan for your life. And if you think, well, but I'm just ordinary. Oh, that's good, because that's who God usually uses. And if he was able to use a fisherman that he met on the beach to start a movement, think of what he would able to do with you. And so the story continues. Jesus called out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people." If up to this point everything had been ordinary, now it would change. It led to an extraordinary request. We don't know of all the conversation that took place, but we know a little bit about it. Jesus sees the guys and he invites them to follow him. But there's more than simply the invitation to follow Jesus. He invites them to join in the adventure, to bring others with them. And it's the same invitation today to follow Jesus. But the invitation isn't simply to follow Jesus. It's never that simple. He still calls us to participate in the adventure. And with Peter, Jesus does what he does so well. He lifts an analogy from everyday life that Peter would understand, and so that he could use his invitation. He doesn't challenge people using agricultural terms or monetary terms. No, instead, he invites him to join in doing what Peter is already comfortable with: fishing. And some people are content to follow Jesus from a distance. But that's not what Jesus is calling people to do. Because you can't follow Jesus without obeying his teaching. The invitation comes in two parts. First, follow Jesus, and then do. The invitation isn't simply follow, and it still isn't. No. There are those who would say they follow Jesus because they read about him. Sure, they know how he was born and how he died. They might even have pictures of him on the walls of their home. But they don't have a relationship with him. That's not following Jesus. That's stalking him. Every once in a while, we hear in the news, don't we, of some celebrity being stalked. And they describe how that person is stalking them and how they become fixated on them. They collect all kinds of information about their personal lives. They read everything they can get their hands on the celebrity. They find that at the checkout counter at the grocery store. And they collect pictures of them. And they talk as if they know them. But there's no relationship there at all. It's all kind of creepy, isn't it? But if you follow Jesus, then ultimately you have a relationship with Jesus. And if you have a relationship with Jesus, then it's defined in the terms that Jesus revealed to Peter and his friends in John 14. Those who accept my commandments and obey them are the ones who love me. And because they love me, my Father will love them. And I will love them and reveal myself to each of them. Jesus invited Peter to follow him. But more than that, he invited him to obey him. Not just hear what Jesus said, but to actually implement it in their daily lives. And it wasn't just a little request either. It was an over-the-top, outside-of-the-box, extraordinary request. And we don't know all about everything about the disciples, but we do know that Peter had a boat and a job. And he had a wife and a house and a mother-in-law that lived with them. But Jesus offered to Peter was so much more than Peter could ever imagine. He would go to places and do things, all that hinged on that invitation. And that is what it was, an invitation. an invitation to follow Jesus and to change the world. And Peter could have said, okay, and gone back to fishing. But that would have been his choice. So let's listen to what happened. Mark 1:18, and they left their nets at once, followed him. See, it finished with an extraordinary decision. The miracle of Christ's call to Peter is that it yields us extraordinary results from plain, old, ordinary people. When I was working, preparing this message, the thought came to me that Jesus actually interrupted Peter's life, didn't he? But Peter's life wasn't just a life interrupted. It was a life dramatically and radically changed. If I'm working in my office at some point and someone comes along and interrupts me, well, when they're done interrupting me, well, I go back to work. But Jesus never intended to simply interrupt our lives. That's what he told us in Luke chapter 9. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways. Take up your cross daily. Follow me. He was saying, if you follow me, your lives will never be the same. And that's why Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians, this means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone, and the new life has begun. You might be thinking, well, that's kind of bizarre, isn't it? I mean, really? Here's this guy walking along the beach, and he sees these four guys fishing, and he asks them to leave everything and follow him. And they do. But we're only seeing a part of the story, the part that's told by Mark. But in John's account, we get a little bit more detail. The day after Jesus was baptized, John the Baptist is standing on the side of the river, chatting with a couple of his followers, and Jesus walks by. And John nods at Jesus and tells the other two guys, behold, the Lamb of God. And immediately we're told the two guys go over and strike up a conversation with Jesus. And we pick up the story in John chapter 1, starting with verse 40. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of these men who heard what John said and then followed Jesus. Andrew went to find his brother Simon and told him, we have found the Messiah. Then Andrew brought Simon to meet Jesus. And if you would continue in this story, you discover that that's when Jesus told Simon, your name is Simon, but you will be called Peter. Now, that might not seem much like to us, except that the name Peter in Greek means rock. And eventually, you recall Jesus told Peter in Matthew 16, now I say to you, you are Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock, I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. Amen. That day at the beach wasn't just some chance meeting between Jesus, Peter, and Andrew. Well, we don't know what was covered in the previous discussion or even whether or not there had been other meetings and conversations before Jesus walked along the beach that day. But what we do know is that Peter was ready at that moment to make a decision. The story of my decision to follow Christ took place on February 20th, 1985. As I was driving alone in my car, and suddenly I heard a voice. Let me explain. I had taken my car to the garage to have some repairs done. and it turns out that it needed a lot of repairs. As a matter of fact, when I got there, the service guy saw me come in, and there was a bunch of people standing there. And he said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, could you wait over there? I need to talk to you." Sort of the tone of his voice, just kind of like, "Uh-oh." So anyway, he when I came up to him, he said, "Okay." He said, "Well, I've got some good news and some bad news." And I said, "This day has not been going good. You might as well give me the bad news now." And he said, "Well, bad news is that your car is fixed, but the bill comes to over $2,300. I got to tell you that I was broke. I was out of work. I was between jobs, and I kind of took a gulp. Really? He said, I said, "Well, what's the good news?" And he said, "The good news is I did some research, and I found out that there's an extended warranty on your car. And we were able to cover the whole cost. And all you have to pay is just the deductible," which turns out it was $75. And I had just enough on my credit card to process that. So I was amazed. And so I left with my car, and I'm driving along, and I remember exactly where I was on Shepherd Avenue in Toronto, Scarborough, and as I'm driving along, and I hear a voice say, "I did that for you." And I touch the brakes a bit, and I look around into the back seat, thinking, well, I guess there's a mechanic that's still in the back of the car. And I kind of shook my head. It's weird. And so I kept going, and I started just moved away. Because I pulled off to the side of the road, kept going, and the voice came. And this time it was so clear, and it said, "I did that for you." And I said, "Lord, is that really you?" You see, at this point, I had no interest in church or God. I believed in God, but I had no interest. But that's not the rest of the story. You see, it turns out that for about a year or so, my best friend had been telling me all about Jesus. And for a year, he had gotten all his friends at church to be praying for me, specifically for me. That's a lot of people praying for me. Church that so it turns out the day that this happened was a Wednesday. And I knew that his church in Toronto, called the Prayer Palace, they had a Wednesday night service. It was a pretty big church, because the Wednesday night service, there was over 600 people there. And I went to the church. I showed up at the church, and I kind of snuck in. He was working that night, and he was one of the ushers there. And so I listened to the message, and then there was an altar call, and a lot of people went down forward. And I was sitting back. I was sitting here in the back of the church. I was looking around. Pretty interesting. And all of a sudden, he was standing off the side, and he was looking around. All of a sudden, he saw me, and he kind of marched over to me, walked right up to me, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I said to him, you know, when you've been telling me that that there's a time in everybody's life when Jesus knocks at the door. And I said, yeah. He said, yeah. And I said, well, today I answered the door. And he said, what? What would you do? I said, I prayed in my car and asked Jesus to come into my heart. And so I didn't know the terminology, so I said, now I'm one of you. Yeah. And he said, well, you better go down to the front and pray then. I said, no, I'm all prayed up. I'm good. He said, well, you better go down and tell the pastor what you did just to make sure you did it right. And so I did. You see, long before I had this conversation with Jesus about following him, I'd had conversations about him and what that would mean. And that is how it happens for a lot of people. This instantaneous conversion. It can take place at the end of a series of events, and events that have happened somehow to you. I'm not even sure that Peter really knew what he was getting into. As we follow this story through, Peter keeps making exciting discoveries about Jesus, this Jesus that he's chosen to follow. Jesus' call to Peter was to join him in a journey. And the invitation is the same today as it was then. When we follow someone, it suggests movement. Jesus may have met Peter where he was at, but he didn't leave him there. Did Peter follow Christ and never look back? No. And that's what makes it exciting. Peter wasn't perfect, and there were times when he let Jesus down, and he knew it. But Jesus never, ever gave up on Peter. And next week, we're going to Luke chapter 5, and we're going to find Peter fishing again. But this time, there's Jesus saying, come on, Peter. You know there's more to you than fishing. Come on. Follow me. And again, Peter puts down his nets and follows Jesus. And because he did it, wasn't just about his future in his life. His life was changed, and the world was changed because of it. And if you never accepted the challenge to follow Jesus, then you need to. Because he's still calling people, just as we sang this morning. He's calling you, he's calling after you. By follow him means to accept his teachings and obey him. And maybe you chose to follow Jesus, but now you find yourself back at pursuing your old life and its agenda. But Jesus wants all of you. And he's still offering you all of him. Amen.